I want to give you the precursor for why I got involved in this Economic Freedom of the World Index now over 30 years ago, when I was about the same age. Actually, I was younger than most of you. I was about 22 years old when I got involved in this project. And but let me go back before that. We've been debating with each other, and I think you've already had some debates amongst yourselves here and probably back at your home colleges and universities about how we should organize our economy. How should we organize our economic lives? Should we organize it the way my hero Adam Smith said we should organize it? Smith advocated for what he called a system of natural liberty. That's a phrase we would not use today. It's very archaic sounding. Today we would use a term like laissez-faire, private enterprise, free enterprise, capitalism, some word like that would get used, and more or less means what Adam Smith meant by system of natural liberty. And he was arguing for things like private property, freedom of trade, reduced monopolies, reduced regulations, and so forth and so on. And Smith argued that in The Wealth of Nations that, well, the wealth of the nation would be larger if you had that system of natural liberty in place. Things would go better. He wasn't a utopian. He never was the kind of thinker. There are thinkers out there who are kind of utopian. He was not the kind of thinker who thought if you followed the system of natural liberty that you would get, heaven on earth. But he thought the world would progress it would work better. In contrast, Karl Marx over here came along half a century or so later, almost a full century later actually, and he thought Smith and the people that came after Smith, like David Ricardo and other economists of that era, he thought Smith and these early economists were crazy. That capitalism, and that was Marx's term, he liked to use the term capitalism. According to Marx, capitalism is a terrible system. It's going to have exploitation, monopolies, business cycles. It's going to be so bad, in fact, for so many people, according to Marx, that eventually the working class will rise up and sort of, with violence, overthrow their capitalist oppressors. So what we have here is the two greatest figures in the history of economic ideas. And one says, hey, free market capitalism kind of works well. It's not perfect, but it works okay, works better. And the other guy says, no, free market capitalism is so bad, it's going to drive us to revolution, quite literally. All right, so that's the stage. The problem with that debate is that it became, yeah.
If it's okay to speak a little bit slowly.
So sorry. I'm a terrible American. I got to remind me. Thank you. So that debate, though, is very ideological most of the time. I was a college student like you once, and I had friends who were Marxists. And I mean that literally. They would wear red armbands on May Day and march through, we don't see as much of that today as we used to, but they were actually Marxists. And they were my best friends. We would go drinking and discussing ideas and doing what college students should do. But I don't think I convinced any of my friends that they should give up Karl Marx and adopt Adam Smith, and they did not convince me to adopt Karl Marx and drop Adam Smith. Those are fond memories, but there was a lot of energy, a lot of heat in those debates, but it really didn't get us anywhere. It didn't yield a resolution to the debate. It was fun, and my fondest memories of college are my arguments with my friends. I forgot all the stuff the professors said already, but I remember my arguments with my friends. But it didn't get us anywhere. So I'd like to contrast that memory of how I remember talking about economics with my friends in college with physics. So I was also a physics student for a minute. The problem was I'm not quite smart enough. And when you're not smart enough to go into physics, you switch to economics. Some of you may have done this, all right? Yeah, see? And I'm gonna own it, right? All right. But I go to physics seminars at SMU where I work. The department's a very strong department. They have a PhD program. They have really good students, and they bring in impressive speakers. And I notice that they argue with each other. The astrophysics group likes to argue. And they will be debating some data. Maybe they pulled it from Hubble or from the James Webb or one of the new experiments. And they'll argue. And it's interesting that the arguments are a lot like economics arguments. It's a disagreement about this or that. And they can get heated. There can be a little intensity sometimes. But there's a difference. What are they arguing about? Data. Primarily, they're arguing about data. They have data in front of them from either an observations of the solar system of the galaxy, or maybe it's data from CERN in Switzerland if it's a particle physics seminar. But they're arguing about data, and they're trying to analyze the data and see which of the theories they have in their heads comes closest to agreeing with the data they have available. And if they don't agree, then they start thinking, well, is the data wrong? Is there something about the way we collected the data? Is this an artifact of the data? Or is our theory wrong? But it's a very data-centric, it's like theory and data are on a same plane and they have this constant battle. And over time, what's happened? Because we have scientists in our world who take their theories of how the world works and they apply the data that they observe in the world we live in, and they're constantly comparing the data to the reality or to their theory, and they update their theory when the data doesn't seem to be consistent with the theory, and so forth. And over time, we now live in an amazing technological age because we've been playing that science game of theory, data, update the theory, get more data, update the theory again, and slowly but surely we accumulate a lot of knowledge. It doesn't seem like in economics we do that. We just argue about the theory. Got the Marxists over here with their red armbands, and then we got the weirdo Adam Smith. I have an Adam Smith tie. If I was wearing a tie, I'd probably be wearing an Adam Smith tie. So you get weirdos wearing Adam Smith ties and red armbands just screaming at each other. And hardly anyone uses data. So I want to use data. That's what I do. What I do is I created, with my co-author Jim Gwartney, who died about a little over a year ago. He came to me, he was my professor, and he said, we're going to do an economic freedom index. We're going to try to measure how close countries get to Adam Smith's system of natural liberty. Now, no country's going to be perfect, but how close do they get? So some countries read The Wealth of Nations, figuratively. They read The Wealth of Nations, and they said, yes, let's do that. And other nations read Karl Marx and said, yeah, let's do that, okay? And so all the countries in the world have gone different ways in the degree to which they have followed Adam Smith or, say, Karl Marx. And we want to try to put a number on it. We want to try to measure it. And the way we do it is we collect data. So it's a big data collection exercise. The current index has 165 countries, including Israel, of course. We have data back to 1970 for many countries, including Israel. Some countries didn't exist in 1970, so we don't have 165 that far back, but we have 130 or something in 1970. And what I do is I collect a lot of data on these 5 big areas. There's 42 variables in the index, so I'm not going to go through all 42. Israeli students are serious, but they're not that serious. You're not going to go and sit here for 42 pieces of data. You would storm out in anger halfway through. But yeah, I'm not going to try it. I'm going to talk about the areas in the big sense. We've got the 5 areas. So let's think about the first one, size of government. And again, I'm using Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations as sort of a guidepost for how I want to think about what data I collect. And size of government, here we're talking about fiscal size, taxes and spending, money. And it's our Internal Revenue Service, whatever your tax people are called. When they come to your house and they take money, right, or from your paycheck. Yeah.
Is it in absolute terms or?
Yeah, it's going to be scaled to the size of the economy. But what we do is we've got a measure here basically of how much money the government spends from taxes, and we break it up for different types of spending. But it's basically how big is the government. Now, Adam Smith was a very small government guy. If you read The Wealth of Nations, there's a chapter in it on public finance. And it's a very short chapter because Adam Smith thought we should have a government-run courts, like judges to settle like property disputes and things like that. Cops, police officers to stop people from fighting in the streets or whatever. A national defense to prevent enemies from invading. Maybe some schools. He was a little tepid on that, but he thought we should have schools. And he had a pretty good understanding of what modern economists call public goods. He didn't use that terminology. He didn't use the terminology of non-rival and the kinds of things we talk about in classes, but he had a pretty good understanding of the kinds of goods that markets may have difficulty providing. Things like roads, bridges, port authority, things like that, big infrastructure projects. But then the chapter's over. That's it. So like my government where I live, the city that I live in owns a hotel. That wasn't on Adam. Adam Smith didn't think the government should run hotels, right? So if you think about, and we have daycare centers and swimming pools and basketball courts, and I can go on and on. If the American government, and I'm sure the Israeli, if this is the size of our governments, this is the size of what Adam Smith thought it should be. It should be a fourth or a fifth or some, much smaller. So in fact, every government in the world is really larger than what Adam Smith advocated in The Wealth of Nations. So we gather data on how big the government is in a tax and spend sense. I use a very advanced branch of mathematics called arithmetic to change the raw data into 0 to 10 index numbers. So a 10 is Adam Smith. So 10 would be a small government, small taxes and small spending, and 0 would be like large. So Sweden would end up getting a very high score because Sweden is famous for its large fiscally large government. So that's this first area. The second area is legal structured property rights. This is the hardest to measure but it's maybe the most important of the 5. It's the bedrock of any system of capitalism, any system of what I call economic freedom, is private property. And private property has a lot of meanings, but one is, do you have it? Like Israel has private property. I'm pretty sure people in Israel are allowed to privately own businesses and farms and things like that. But then the question is, how good are those property rights? So I'm going to pick on Bob because he's in back. And suppose I gave Bob, and I can also pronounce his name, I know. Suppose I give Bob $5 and to wash my car. I say, Bob, here's $5, and he agrees to wash my car. But I didn't realize it. He's a flake, and he doesn't wash my car. He runs off to the pub and he buys a beer and drinks a beer with my $5. But I know, right? Well, he's a thief. He's not a thief. He didn't steal the money. He's not like a mugger, but he's almost like a mugger, because what does a mugger do? A mugger comes up and takes $5 from you and runs to the pub and drinks a beer. But a contract violator, he's a contract violator. He violated my property rights. We had a contract, and that contract had property rights. I gave him $5 of my property, and he agreed to do a service, but he didn't do it. So he's like a criminal, in a sense. So the question is, how hard is it going to be to settle if I sue him? I wouldn't sue anyone over $5. I would just come punch him and take my $5 back. But how long and how expensive is it going to be? Well, the World Bank has collected data on this. And in some countries, they say it takes a year. My country, the United States, they say about a year to settle a dispute. I've never been in court in America, so I think that's probably about right for a simple case, simple property dispute. Probably takes a few months, maybe a year. I think they said it takes a few $100s, maybe thousands, not a lot. In some countries, it was 6 years. The data say it takes 6 years to settle a simple. So where is my property more secure? Well, obviously, in a country that takes a year to settle a dispute, your property is more secure than in a country that takes 6 years. In fact, if it takes 6 years, I'm probably not going to, we're not going to use the court system probably, right? So that's an idea of the kinds of things. And I've got a bunch of other variables. These tend to be survey-based, unfortunately, because what you have to do, because most countries have a law in the books that says you have private property. The question about how good the court system is, how efficient it works, these things tend to be measured with surveys. And we get these from different sources. I mentioned the World Bank. We also have data from the World Economic Forum, the Economist Intelligence Unit. There's a group called Varieties of Democracy, which despite the name democracy in it, actually has a lot of economic stuff. So we have data from a variety of sources. We're trying to capture basically how efficient the legal system is working. A lot of this really is close to the concept of the rule of law, how even-handed the rule is. Because what if I sued Bob for that $5, but his second cousin was the judge, right? Now, we all know in a country with the rule of law, the judge should not take that case. Some unbiased judge should take the case. But we all know in reality, in many countries, the people that are in court, it's a biased situation for one reason or another. Okay, so those are the kinds of things that are in there. The third area is, we call it sound money. One of the things I did when I turned 16 and I learned how to drive is this was, my father told me to do this. He said, get $100. It was a lot of money when I learned how to drive. And you should fold it up and then put it in your wallet and then try to forget about it. And this was in case your car broke down and you needed to hire a tow truck or, pay a mechanic on the side of the road to help fix your car, that kind of thing. We didn't have Visa cards. Well, I didn't anyway have a Visa card or cell phones. So it was a good insurance policy to carry around a little extra cash. Now here's the problem. A year goes by and I'm cleaning my wallet out and you find the $100 bill. Now that's great, that's kind of nice. You forgot about it and you find this $100 bill. What's the problem though when I take that $100 to the store? It's worthless. It's worth less. It's not worthless, it's worth less. If inflation's been 5% this year, it's like someone took $5 out of the wallet. Now they didn't, it's still physically a $100 bill. It's the same $100 bill that I put into the wallet. But if inflation's been 5%, it's like a 5% tax on the value of that piece of paper. Monetary economists call it the inflation tax. It's what we call it. Any asset that's denominated in currency terms, well, currency is, but so are leases, bonds, mortgages, insurance policies. We have, without exaggeration, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollar amounts written on pieces of paper, and those pieces of paper trade. And the value of those pieces of paper can be taxed away by inflation. So we have a measure of inflation in there. We have a few other measures in the third area related to the sort of soundness of the monetary system. Give you one example. There's a variable in there about whether you can own a foreign currency bank account. I haven't memorized all the data. I assume in Israel, if you wanted to own a bank account in euro, you would be allowed to do that, right? Now you can. It used to be illegal, right? Yeah. If you were in Venezuela today, would you find this to be an important freedom, the freedom to own a foreign currency bank account? Yeah, if you were in Venezuela and where inflation has been running 20, 30,000% a year, you would love to be able to own a euro or a dollar bank account because you would find that to be a much more secure way to save your property. Not surprisingly, by the way, Venezuela doesn't let people do this. So anyway, that's a type of thing, a type of monetary freedom. Can I own another currency in addition to the currency that my government gives us? Okay, everyone has a government money that they use, but the question is, can you own another one? All right, the fourth area is free trade. If you think of Adam Smith, the first thing you probably should think about is he was a free trader. He was an unapologetic free trader. And it was a crazy argument in 1776. This crazy Scotsman is telling the British that they should trade freely with the French. Within a year of Adam Smith's publication of The Wealth of Nations, the British and the French had yet another war with each other, declared war over the American. Thank you, France, by the way. So England or Britain and France had been bitter enemies for centuries. And this crazy guy in Scotland says, well, we should trade with them freely. We should eliminate all the barriers. And you know what his argument was? Yeah, their wine is good and it's cheap. It was a simple argument. It's like, you know what? Cheap wine is a wonderful thing. We can grow wine in Scotland, he says. You can. It's just, it's like 30 times more expensive and not nearly as good as the wine you just can buy it from the French. Why are we killing ourselves trying to make Scottish wine? And you can make wool in Scotland. They have some mountains, of course. You can make wool. But you know what? We're really good, especially in Scotland, at making wool. And our wool is better and it's cheaper. than French wool. If we send them wool and they send us wine, we all get richer. We all have more wool, better wool, more wine, cheaper wine. Everyone gets happy. And that was his argument. It's the same argument we use today. It was a little bit more primitive than the argument that we use today, but it was the same argument. And it was insane. Everyone's like, you are insane. It's still insane, right? You don't have to follow American politics, but like most people think this argument is a crazy argument. It's a true argument. Adam Smith is right, but most people find this very difficult to accept. Anyway, this is an Adam Smith index. So I get data from the World Trade Organization on tariffs. Not the level of tariffs, but also how variable they are. I get data on capital controls. Adam Smith didn't talk about capital controls much, but basically investment flows, not just buying goods and services across country borders, but also investing across country borders is heavily regulated. So we have in this fourth area restrictions on goods, but also restrictions on capital. And then lastly, we have an area called regulation. It's a bunch of regulations. We cannot measure all regulations. Regulations tend to be very country specific. Like that country's got a weird regulation and no other country has it. Those are hard for us because I want to have 165 countries in my index. So I'm only going to have in my index the kinds of general regulations that most countries have, like minimum wages. Not all, but most countries have a minimum wage. And we can get those data pretty easily from the World Bank. Adam Smith would have thought the regulation of having the government tell people what the lowest wage they could work at would be, he would think that's a violation of the system of natural liberty. People should be able to work with what they want in Smith's world. So countries that have low minimum wages get better scores. Countries with really high minimum wages would get lower scores. I don't know Israel well enough, but another labor market example is severance pay. If you get fired from your job. So in America, I would say, suppose you work at Starbucks and you get fired in America because you're just bad at your job. Maybe you steal. You're just not good. They fire you. In America, how much money does the law say Starbucks has to give an employee when they fire them? Zero. We don't have a law for that. We have no mandate regulation. But is there one in Israel?
Yeah, 1 month per
It's only 1 month? Per year. So if you've been there 10 years, you would get 10 months. Okay.
We just spoke about it in the public sector.
Did you just tell you? Okay. That's not as bad as France. I think in France, if you have 3 years on the job, you get a whole year. Which is why it's very hard to get a job in France, because I'm not hiring someone unless I'm pretty sure. And I mean, and what's weird, I don't know about Israel, but in some countries there's a clause that says if it's for, like, if they steal, you may be able to not.
Yeah.
But in France, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you could literally have, driven your truck through the building, and they would still make you pay them severance. Anyway, those are the kinds of things in the fifth area. So yeah.
In Israel, we have pension sorting when we work.
Yeah.
Is it something that goes into the index?
Yeah, so we would include the pension tax and pension spending if it runs through government, like our Social Security program is a government-funded tax and spend program. That would go into area 1 though, because it's really just a tax and spend. Where the index is, and we've had some conversations in our team about how we would work this in. We haven't done anything though. Is if the government makes you privately save. So Chile, for example, Chile doesn't have a government-run program, but they do force Chileans to save for retirement. So many countries do this. We don't have that in the index. Just the last year, though, a friend of mine wrote an article, and he kind of outlined how we would do that, how we would measure it, and and maybe work it in. And I haven't decided actually whether we're going to do it or not, because it turns out pension systems. Remember, like I said, for regulations, you want to have simple regulations that most countries have, It turns out the complexity of pension systems from country to country to country to country, it's like you have 165 different things. And if I have one thing that some people have more and some people have less, I can measure that. But if it's different from place to place, it's very hard to get an apples to apples like rating system. So anyway, we don't include that. I would like to, I just don't know quite yet how to do it.
It's a little bit, it's a lot of time change from the time from the country.
Yeah.
And for example, in Israel, it's like change, I think, 5 or 6 times in big changes.
Right. We do, that's why we have a data series that goes back in time. We do. Yeah.
How do you measure access to sound money?
Well, it's got 3 measures of monetary growth and price stability and price inflation. We have the measure on, we've got the foreign currency bank account measure. What else is in there? Oh, that's it. So there's just those things. It's really, they're easy to get. I mean, I do area 3 and afternoon because it's all very basic, easy to acquire data. Some of the data sets that we use, you have to do a lot of work. That's not. It's just like World Bank data. Hong Kong is hard right now. We all know that China, Beijing, has been cracking down politically very hard on China. So it's increasingly a difficult place to live in that dimension. But when it comes to economics, even now, even after the crackdown, Hong Kong's economics, narrowly thinking economics, are in the things we were just talking about, are still pretty good. The top tax rate is 30%. There's no real inflation problems. The courts are working not as well as they used to, but they still, like, I would be comfortable suing someone and taking a property case to a Hong Kong court. The judges actually wear powdered wigs. It's like England. It's weird. They have, what's the tariff rate in Hong Kong is 0. They have none. All right. So you think about the things I was talking about, Hong Kong's going to be very high. The political stuff that's happened in the last few years is not the kinds of stuff that's in our index. So I think that stuff's very important. But this is 2000, oh, why did we go too far? 2022 is the most recent data I have. The 2024 report, we're always about 2 years behind. So I'm right now working on 23. Yeah.
Colors that don't, I mean, they're surprising. So
Yeah. Well,
explains it.
yeah. Yes.
I've heard a lot of question about the reality of the data that came from China economic system. So,
yeah. So China's, that's cute. I also have Congo in this index, right? And I lose a lot more sleep over the Republic of Congo quality of data than I do China's quality of data. I mean, every country's got quality issues.
say that there are also like other countries that involved in the economic, and in
Right.
China it's isolated economic.
Yeah, so I actually don't have terrible qualms about Chinese data that I use. I do use some GDP data, and that's the big area that we're concerned with is that they've been playing games with their GDP growth and GDP numbers. But like their tax rates are statutory. That's just a number in a book. There's no gaming that. Tariff rates in the WTO, a lot of these things, and they're just, so I'm not terribly worried. I am worried. Here's the thing, there is absolutely measurement error in this index. There's measurement error in every measuring tool, right? The question is, how big is the measurement error relative to the sort of sample, right? So the thermometer in this room isn't very accurate, but it works close enough for our purposes. It would be terrible in a physics lab, right? Where you need more precision. I've got Hong Kong, and the lowest scored country is Venezuela. So the range of countries that I have is Hong Kong and Venezuela. And if there's a little bit of fuzziness in the data, it's going to be pretty small relative to the scale of the thing I'm measuring. Does that make sense? So I don't worry too much about it. I do worry, I mean, we'd all want better data, but that's not the big issue. Yeah.
The data is from the World Bank, or the country send for you how it's worked? Because
No. I get almost no data from the country. very rarely, sometimes, but it's very unusual. One of the things I do, we have a partner group, a network of think tanks. We have one in Israel. I've never heard from them though, but it's on our list. They get an email every year with about a month's notice, and I say, hey, look, here's the data prospectively. Here's the new data for the coming year. Take a look. Most of them either don't look at it or they look at it and it says that seems fine. And I'll get a few emails, and sometimes I'll use, if I get a really hard, like that number is wrong. And I'll ask them, do you have a number that is better, and where does it come from? I can tell you one thing, everything is from a third-party source. We don't make numbers up. I insist that every number in our index, I can point to the source that it came from. Now that source may be garbage, right? But it's someone else's garbage, not my garbage. And that's important because I wanted to, as the architect of this index, I wanted to make sure that my biases, and I know I have them, we all do, weren't going in. But I have to acknowledge that whoever I'm getting the number from, whether it's the World Bank or the Economist Intelligence Unit or whoever, they may have a bias or they may just be wrong for some reason. I can't, that's just the reality of it. We have various ways when we look at new data to help us decide, do we like it? Is it trustworthy? We try to audit these things. And over time, we've taken data out of the index because we didn't think it was trustworthy or it wasn't working the way we thought it was supposed to work. But yeah. So anyway, these are the top 10 and the bottom 10. If you look at the top 10, I think it should be, again, Hong Kong and Singapore are a little strange. They're very small, but they're very free market as these things go. The top tax rate in Singapore is 25%, not 20. There's no tariffs in Singapore either. Singapore courts work reasonably well. They're both kind of authoritarian. I mean, neither one of them is Stalin's Russia, let's be honest. It's not that bad, but they're not liberal democracies. But every other country on the top 10 is, something like a liberal democracy. And these are the countries, if you would look at them, like, I think that's, that's about right. Sometimes people say, hey, what about Denmark? Bernie Sanders says Denmark is socialist. And when Bernie Sanders said that, you may remember, maybe you don't, but he said, the Danish prime minister got mad and called a press conference immediately and said, we're not socialists. Think about Denmark and Sweden. Is that a socialist economy? Is the government of Sweden running the economy? I think the answer is no. Swedish farmers grow food. Swedish fishermen go out on their boats. They catch fish. I'll show you a picture on Wednesday of a Swedish bar where they serve great beer. And they tax you a lot, but they don't control economic life. They simply let you do your economic life, and then they say, oh, by the way, we're going to take half of it. And that's, I'm not in favor of that really, but that's a different thing. It's not socialism, it's not government control. So Denmark actually is in the top 10. They have a very large, if you think about the areas of the index, Area 1 is really a bad score. But what do you think about the Danish courts? We would all like to have Danish courts in our country, wouldn't we? All right, monetary, not really. Free trade, pretty good. Regulations in Denmark are probably easier to comply with than the United States. So it's a myth. I think it's a myth. One of the things our index has shown is that it's a myth to think of the Nordic countries as hard socialist countries. They're not. They have much more in common with Hong Kong and the United States than they do real socialist countries. Like Venezuela is really socialist. The government literally controls. They own hotels. They own beer companies. They own businesses, farms. They own entire markets, banks. The government is running the economy with almost very little being allowed for private initiative. I'm getting a lot of hands, so let me go.
So I was wondering if the index considers whether, what type of government interference is it? Because Denmark does have it at a large scale, but not in the form of owning.
Yeah, well, we do in Area 1. They get a very low score in Area 1. And that's a fifth of the index. It's all pretty evenly weighted. And you could argue that maybe that we should weight that more or less. The funny thing about government spending is I have friends who think we shouldn't have it in there at all. They would like to see zero weight on it. And then I've got other friends who think it should be 40%, not 20%. So I don't know what the right weighting system is. We're kind of making that up. But in terms of our index, only a fifth of the index is tax and spend. And in that area, I mean, Denmark's got a 4 out of 10. It's not good. It's a terrible score. I mean, overall, they're like an 8 out of 10. So what is it? 8. Look at that. Nailed it. 8.02. So, but Area 1 really brings them down. And that's right. They do have a large government. They do not let you keep if you think of like a John Locke, they don't let you keep the fruits of your labor. Well, they let you keep half of it, but the other half is going to go to the government. So we don't really, we do include it, just not as much as some people do.
I have a question because it's 2020 I see it in Argentina. So it's very interesting when you see a different country that for 2 or 4 years change a lot of if you have like example.
Well, I'm very interested in Argentina, as we all are. If my index is doing its job, we should see in Argentina's numbers increase. But it's yeah, there's no question. I mean, government spend, Area 1 is way down. As a share of GDP, government spending is down by almost 10 percentage points of GDP. Regulations are way down. Monetary policy is vastly improved. So 3/5 of the index should see serious improvements. I would be very surprised. I don't think they're going to go in. They're not going to go into that top 10. I know that, but if the index is working, I'll have to find out when we put the numbers in.
Do you have an example of country that for a few years changed a lot of?
Yeah. Georgia. Well, I have one, and we're in it. I'll talk about Israel in a second, but Georgia's the other one I would talk about a lot. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What about the fact that in Denmark and in Sweden, they have rights like social rights? For instance, when a woman gives birth, I think they have I hope I'm not mistaken, but I think they have about 2 or 3 years of maternity leave.
Right.
Or I think the school system is free, including universities.
Yeah.
So where do you put this in the?
Yeah. So the good question. It does actually highlight something I skipped too. We wouldn't have anything on the maternity or the parental leave policy or whatever you'd call it. We just don't have numbers on that. Again, it's the Congo problem. I could get data like that for the sort of top half of the countries.
And my question was, let me clarify. The question was, you said that those countries are not socialist, right?
Right.
Like, I mean, according to this.
Right.
But when they give so many social benefits.
Right. Yeah, so it is possible to regulate your way into socialism. In other words, you could keep the property in a nominal sense private. Hey, that's your farm, but then the government could regulate how you farm so much that it's almost as if they took it over. And that could be true of a lot of things. So you could have socialism of that type. And so if regulations on businesses got so involved in so many areas, and we do have regulations, and Denmark and Sweden get pretty low scores there, especially in the labor market area where in labor markets, not so much in general business, but in labor, and they get a very low score in that labor part of the regulation area, and you would get penalized for that. If I had data, which I really don't on that, I would include it. What was the second example?
They have, I think, their school system.
Oh, school system.
Basically from 0 to like.
Yeah, well, that's mostly through spending though. So that shows up in Area 1. It's a budget item, so we usually get that. All right. Yeah, one of the reasons the U.S. is cheaper, smaller government than a lot of places, we don't give away free college education. We subsidize it out of it, but we don't give it away.
I wonder about the amount of taxes because U.S. Does pay for a lot of the security. Now not so much, but like the security of Europe. So like maybe like it's not fair to measure like how much taxes the European like charge their population because some of it are being paid by someone else.
Yeah, that's a really subtle point. I have sympathy for it. There's two kind of embedded issues there that we've thought about. I don't think we've got good answers here. One is the quality of the government spending. I mean, you could raise $1 in taxes and turning it into a daycare center, and people like, Adam Smith would say, well, you're really not supposed to have governments taxing people to create daycare centers. That wasn't in, but it's a daycare center. It's not evil, right? It's nice. But you could have another government that taxes $1 away and buys bullets that they use to shoot their own people with at protests. Obviously, the latter is a worse dollar than the first one. We would count, in the area one, we would say $1 is $1 is $1. But remember, we have other areas, like area two, especially property rights, rule of law, where I think we pick up the quality of the spending. So I have sympathy for the other argument that some people, like sometimes there's a spillover to another country like the U.S., but it's still our dollars. So I want to penalize the U.S. government even if they're, sort of protecting other countries. It's still a violation of my economic freedom because it's my dollar that they took, right? So that's how I would still view that. But I think you're right. There's a sort of almost like a tax incidence issue here that we don't really have well controlled for. I want to mention, since the gender, like the social rights with respect to women came up, we didn't always do this, but about somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, but a few years ago, we now adjust that second area, the property rights area, for whether or not women are treated equally as men in the legal system. The World Bank has a really nice set of codings. And so, for example, it's just an economic stuff, so it's not about whether women are treated equally with men socially or culturally or anything like that. But things like, can you own property in the same way a man can? Can you inherit property in the same way a man can? Can a woman work at night in the same way a man can? Like, in other words, is there symmetry between men and women in economic regulations? And if there is an asymmetry, and Israel has asymmetries under the law, I notice Israel does not get a perfect score for the gender. What we do is we adjust the second area number. If you have some legal restrictions on women's participation in the legal area or the economy that you don't have for men, that you get downgraded, you get penalized a little bit. And so Israel gets a small penalty in the second area because there's I think 2 of the 14 things we track, there's women or get coded differently. I don't even know which ones they are, but yeah.
You adjust for race and ethnicity?
I would if we had data. Yeah, absolutely. Problem is, race and ethnicity, of course, varies so much from country to country. Chinese are a majority in China, but they're a minority in Malaysia. It's very fractured. The nice thing is, men and women, more or less, 50% of most populations are. We don't have to. So that's common enough across all countries that we can deal with it. And if I had data on that, I absolutely would consider it. I would do. If there were homosexual laws or something or whatever, I would include these things if I had data on that. Again, homosexuals are small enough of the population. Not doing it probably doesn't drive results, but when you've got 50% of the population that can't engage in the economy in the same way as the other 50%, that's not a small thing, right? That's a big thing. So I'm glad we're able to account for that. I'm going to go you two, and then over here first. Yeah, yes, sir.
Do you or can you create statistical models to try and find outcomes that correlate?
Yeah, can you give me about 10 more minutes?
Regarding the women issue, do you consider limitation on driving an economic issue, or you take it?
We don't have driving in there. And I'm not sure if it's because that data set doesn't have that variable or not, but it's not one of the 14 or something like we had. I probably would include it. I mean, being able to drive to work sounds like an economic thing. Economic and social, it's not like there are always bright lines between these things, but I've contracted that aspect out to a gal named Rosie Fike, who studied with my professor at Florida State, Jim. So we basically just, whatever she tells us is in that gender adjustment, we go with what Rosie says. She publishes in this area, it's her area. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question about if you take something about army and if the preparation must go to the army, because if you take Israel, for example, women need to do 2 years, men almost 3 years, so it's depends when we are start go to the university and everything.
I don't think we have the military difference in that gender thing, but we do have conscription in the index. I should have mentioned that being here. I mean, military conscription, necessary though it may be, in some places, is absolutely a violation of your economic freedom to decide how you want to work. If you want to work for the government and pick up arms, but if you don't have a so we do it by length of service, and it's for Israel, I know we use the men's length. And you get a 0. I mean, 0 out of 10. I mean, and Milton Friedman, to drop a name, Milton Friedman, who everyone probably knows, Nobel Prize winning economist. I was at a conference with him. He was involved in the early thinking about the index. He didn't do any data work, but he was involved in the thinking. And he used to say, if I was in Israel, I would support conscription. And it's a violation of their freedom. What you're doing is you're trading off freedom for security. That's fine. We all do that. We all do that. When I give money to the government to buy cops and to buy defense, I'm giving up some of my freedom for security. Trade-offs exist. But what I don't want to do is hide that trade-off and act like it's not there. It's absolutely a trade-off. Because you've got a security problem and you have conscription, you are losing something. You're losing 2 or 3 years of your lives at a minimum, and sometimes more, right? So I think if I was Israeli, it's not my position to say, but I would probably support it too, right? I mean, I would accept that trade-off, but it is a trade-off. So we get occasional complaints about conscription being in there because people want to confuse, I think, security with freedom. And hey, sometimes we have to give up one thing to get something else. Yeah. All right, so these are some of the larger countries. The color codings are quartiles. Blue is top quarter, green is the second quarter, yellow third, red is the fourth. Israel is 41st with a very precisely measured 7.44. It's around 7.4, 7.5. And it's right on that border of the green and the blue. I think some years, when you see that map, some years it's green, some years it's blue. It kind of depends on where they fall that particular year. You're about the 75th percentile is what I'm getting at. And I'll show you a graph in a second of Israel's changes over time, which is spectacular. If you look at this, though, hopefully this isn't this basic district. These are the larger, more well-known, more populous nations, and hopefully that ordering is kind of what you might have expected. I think it is. I think the United States is, we're a market economy. We're, relatively speaking, compared to most. Venezuela is absolutely terrible. It's completely run by the government now, right? You get into the greens. Those are the countries that are, they're private property countries. Italy, Mexico. But, something's going wrong. They're messing up something, right? They're not measuring up a lot because they're still in the top half, but they're missing like one of those areas is going haywire. Maybe it's that they're spending too much, like Italy probably has too much spending. Or maybe it's they've got an inflation problem that's a little bit too much, or maybe they've got a weaker property rights, like Indonesia would have a bad property rights score, I'm sure. So it's not sure which of the areas is the problem, but probably one of those. If you're a blue, you're probably getting most of your areas kind of okay, maybe a little lower in one or the other, but green usually means you've got a bad one. Yellow means you got 2 or 3 bad ones. Like you're really, there's some fairly across the board stuff going on. Again, which it is, it could be that your trade policy, it could be your monetary policy, it could be your taxes, who knows. And then red means you got all of them pretty much bad. That's kind of how it works, okay? China and Russia, lots of questions about China. I did not have, this is for 2022, I did not have a score for Mao's China. Why not? There's no Mao's China. No data. Yeah, I mean, World Trade Organization, World Bank, World Economy, like there's no numbers for 1970, 1975 China. There's no numbers. No numbers, no, they're not under my index. Even today, I don't include Cuba and North Korea. I know where they go. They go at the bottom of the scores. But I don't have any data for these countries. So we're a data-driven index. If you don't have the sort of critical mass of externally produced data from these sort of sources I've mentioned, you just don't make it. So I don't have a number. I think China shows up for the first time in like 85. Well, by then, Mao's dead. Deng Xiaoping has already begun the reforms which began in 1978. So by the time we even pick up China, they've already done a lot of reforms. And where are they now? Well, 6.5-ish, 6.1, okay. Is that good? Not really, it's bottom half. What number would Mao have gotten? If Venezuela is a 3.02, Mao during the Great Leap Forward would be a 1.02, right? I mean, or 0.02, I mean, I don't know, right? I don't know, but I know that whatever it was before was a lot worse than what it is now. I know there's been a lot of reforms in China. We are picking it up, but we don't even get the data until it's already halfway done, right? That's the downside of this, okay? To a lesser extent, the same thing is true of India. We do have India all the way through, so we do see their increases, but India is still, some parts of the Indian economy have liberalized a lot, other parts have not. So remember I mentioned that if you're yellow, you're probably messing up 2 or 3 of the 5 areas. And India is basically, they've liberalized their trade a lot, but internally it's still kind of a disaster. Yeah.
I want to ask you about distribution, especially in the upper echelon. You talked about how in certain categories you see that 2 or 3 areas are really bad, like in countries that are doing poorly. In the countries that are doing relatively well, do you see that usually there's one area that really brings the...
Yeah, it's area 1, the spending one. So a lot of those countries at the top of the index, the Denmarks. Yeah, they get good property rights. Money and inflation are stable. Trade policy, it's not free trade, but tariffs are pretty low. Regulations are really bad in labor markets, but like construction permits and just normal regulations are fine. But they'll get hurt on area 1. Yeah. So that's probably the area that if there's an area of the 5 areas that sometimes looks weird next to the other, it's going to be 1. So because you've got basically a dozen or so countries that have really big tax and spends, but pretty good at everything else.
And do you see other areas that tend to bring?
Not really. Mostly, if you start messing up one of the other ones, you're going to start kind of all of them. You start, that's the one. You can be a little schizophrenic almost. You can be really, and then high functioning, and you can be bad, low functioning in area 1 and still survive the other 4. But that doesn't usually work with the other ones.
Just soft elements like window guidance and credit in Japan, and would that factor in area 3, and also federation level regulations such as EU regulation for France?
Yeah.
Would that count as 4 and 5 or 5?
Okay, so we give. Wow. I don't think I know what the answer to the first one is. I'm not sure what that is. So.
Well, they direct credit with recommendations, but don't really physically.
If that comes up, it's going to come up through those sort of soft rule of law type things, and I don't. And I can't. But the problem is the way those things are done. I can't, with authority, say that's what it's getting. So the second part, what's the second part?
France and European level regulation.
Yeah, so it's a France number. We give a number for France. We give a number that is for Germany separately from each other. It's really only in the trade area that they all get the same score, more or less. Because with respect to external trade, it's a common market more or less internally, and then with respect to external trade, they're all common. So that's the one area that we have to kind of, I have to go to another book or a different line in the book, because if you look up tariff rates for France, it's got a dash, there's nothing there. You got to find the line for Euro, and then I apply that to all the EU countries. So that's we don't currently have to do that with monetary stuff. We obviously have the European Monetary Union as well, but they still report distinct money supplies, distinct inflation rates and things like that by country. So long as that's possible, I'm going to keep doing it that way. Yeah. but I'm not sure how long. I can see a future where I'm going to have to give everybody in the EMU like the same score. Yeah. I'm going to go in order from this gentleman here.
Does freedom of speech play a role in the ratings?
No. No. You got to draw an admittedly arbitrary line between economics and not economics. That's a little bit of a cop-out, but the other thing is there's other people who were, when we started this index, no one was doing an economic freedom index. There were other people doing like civil liberties indexes and things like that. They still do them, like Freedom House. And so we didn't want to, we didn't feel the need. We thought the gap in the world was not having a sort of mundane, like economic freedoms, people just don't respect them the way they think. They think of free speech, freedom of religion as being like these, religiously important. Well, people don't think of like, can I open my business or, without having to pay a bribe. People don't think that is being important for some reason. I think it's pretty important.
But do you see correlation?
So yes, we do, and I'll show that in a second, yeah. You, and then I'm gonna make sure I move on a little bit.
Is there a state that you were surprised by its performance for good or bad?
On the index, all the time, yeah. So I mean, one of the things, I'm an academic who went to public schools. So I don't know a lot about the world. I do now, I guess I've learned this, but when I started this, Mauritius is a country that I remember. I'm like, I hadn't even heard of it, right? It's in the book. I have all the data, so they made it into the index. I had to go figure out where it is. Well, it's an island in the Indian Ocean, okay? And I didn't know anything about it. It turns out it's mostly populated by South Asians. It's African by geography, but Asian by culture and demographics. And they were getting really good scores. I was like, wow, I mean, not like we weren't like Hong Kong good, but they were like, wow, like Africa's scores are not good. Huh? They were just like, their property rights were pretty good. All the numbers I was putting in. No, not really. No, they're really, that's the thing, they're really not. I didn't know anything about it. I looked at it. I had a friend in South Africa and I was like, do you ever, and he's like, yeah, I vacation there all the time. It's great. So. It's very small. It's basically a small trading center in the middle of the Indian Ocean. People, they have a lot of, it's like a little bit like Hong Kong. Ships come and it's like a logistics. They have resorts for beaches too, but they have a lot of like ships will come there and they'll trade stuff and they'll go out like differently, so yeah, it's basically a big supply depot. So anyway, in income, I think I'm going to throw a number out. I bet it's 15%, $15,000. It's not terrible. It's low middle income. Okay. I'm going to have two more, and then I'm going to make us move a little bit. Yes.
Regarding the index of free trade, regarding free trade, or maybe I'm a little bit early in my question, how do you adjust when one country, like a little bit like America, so America provided a lot of free trade, and other countries like China will not provide free trade. So when there's an imbalance between the two countries, how do you adjust it? That's kind of like what Trump said.
Yeah,
it says farm free trade, but you're the only one that's providing it.
Yeah, our unit of analysis is that country and its decisions over its trade policy. So, there may be a very good argument for, say, raising tariffs in the United States right now to retaliate or to encourage China to lower theirs or whatever. That may be a good argument. I don't care. I'm just measuring the tariff rate. So if the U.S. government taxes imports, that's a tax on imports. It's a violation of my freedom to buy imports. So, whether it's a good idea or not is actually a separate question that we're pretty silent on.
No, I'm just asking if there's any way to adjust trade imbalance in the data perspective.
Yeah, so that's just it. We don't, and I wouldn't want to. My view is that if China is bad to us, that's terrible. They should be good to us. But if the U.S. response to another country being bad to us is to hurt ourselves, well, that's hurting ourselves. That's what I'm measuring, is the degree to which, you could try to do an index like how much does China's government hurt me as an American, but I don't even know how I'd begin to do that. Yeah, so, all right. I want to show you a couple trends. So this is the overall world average. I could have started this earlier, but I just stole this from the book we do, and we only do the last 20 years or so. So this starts in 2020. If I went back to 1980, it would be even more dramatic. But we have lived. Your lifespan has basically been the lifespan. If you don't like it, you call it neoliberalism. If you like it, you call it liberalism. But this has been a period of time where more countries than not, most countries, almost all countries have begun moving towards Adam Smith. Government spending is ever so slightly gone down. Tax rates have definitely gone down. Corruption is down. Rule of law is actually better. Not a lot, but better. If you think about the 80s, and monetary policy and inflation is much better today. We got some holdouts like Venezuela and Argentina, but it's still, until recently. Trade is much, much better. Like tariff rates around the world. We have spent a lot of energy and effort over the last 50 years lowering tariff rates, opening up global markets. So basically area after area after area, the world is liberalized. You do see a couple hiccups. You see a little bit of a downturn in the financial crisis because what do governments do when things go bad? They spend money and regulate. That's the only tools they have in their tool chest. That's what they do. And after the financial crisis in 07 and 8 and 9, governments spent a lot of money and they regulated, especially in capital controls. And so the scores, this is the global average. It went down, and it went down a little over 1/10 of a point. But then it pretty quickly got back on trend, right? And then, of course, this thing that happened in 2020, forget what it was. So yeah, COVID COVID is 3 times bigger loss of economic freedom in our index than the financial crisis was. Because how did the governments react to COVID? They taxed and they regulated and they cut trade and travel and all that stuff. I'm hoping that we get back on trend, although I'm increasingly pessimistic, frankly. I think what we may do is just go down and then the trend will but it's going to be a long time before we get back to whatever you would have thought. Yeah.
In the COVID-19 folder, is there any outliers that meaning of go lower or the whole on average?
Yeah, every country in the world went down except for 2 African countries who I don't remember. And they didn't go up, they just were they went up like 0.01, they were flat. So there were some countries that were so poor that they couldn't, if they wanted to raise taxes, there's nothing to tax, there's nothing there, right? Like Congo, I think, was one of the 2 Congos, I don't know if it was Republic or Democratic Republic. But there's, if they wanted to regulate more, there's nothing to regulate. The countries are so absolutely poor, it's pretty hard for them to get worse than they already were. But every country, 100%. Financial crisis was not like that. The financial crisis, you had individual countries who were going down a lot, but many countries it wasn't a thing for them. You know, the financial crisis was pretty much a Western Europe, U.S., and Southeast Asia thing. South America, they were like, whatever. Africa didn't care. Large parts of Asia, even like South Asia, it's like, whatever. Malaysia, Philippines got murdered. And they reacted pretty violently with new policies. But so that was a difference. The financial crisis was a narrower crisis. So you had deeper losses in the countries that were affected. But COVID was, across the board. So anyway, I want to show you Israel. I talk a lot about Israel, even though I don't know anything about it. Because it is one of the, and I talk about Georgia because I do know a lot about Georgia. I've been to Georgia 17 times. So I've written books and articles about Georgia. I've not written any books and articles about Israel. But Israel is on my radar because of that right there. I don't have to tell you your history, but the Zionist movement was a socialist movement. That's what it was, right? And the kibbutzim were socialist enterprises. They weren't state socialists, to their credit. It wasn't like the Soviet Union, but this country was founded by a lot of socialists, and it doesn't really work very well. And if you know Israel's history, the economy of Israel really, really was bad for a very long time. much to our credit, because a lot of Israelis, first-generation Israelis left, or the children of first-generation Israelis left, because they're like, this place is terrible, we can't get a job, I'm going to be a doctor and move to Philadelphia. And so America benefited a lot by Israeli emigres, second generation, because the economy here was just garbage. It's we made fun of it. We made fun of you. You know, it was like, a bunch of basket case. And you see the score in 1980, 4.26. It's not as low as it gets, but it's all close. I think the ranking was about 90th out of 125. So if you colored it, it would have been red, right? So Israel was hard socialist. It was never Stalinist, to its credit. And it's a great testament to this country that you were able to maintain something like a functioning democracy while you did that. Because most countries that have socialist economies do not have liberal democracies. There's actually one example, and you're it. And the problem is the economy was terrible. So what happened in Israel, to cut it short, right around the late 80s, voters were like, yeah, this is not working. They started electing less socialist leaders and parties. The index started getting better. People your age, I tell this to American students, when people in America think of Israel today, young people, your age people, they think of this, like if they think about economics, forget about the Palestine, all this security stuff, but if they think about the economy of Israel, they think of, that's hydroponics, that's high tech, that's like this little Silicon Valley type thing going on. And that, people have a very optimistic, upbeat, positive, entrepreneurial vibe about this economy. Maybe it's overstated, but compared to where it was, right? And people are now moving back to Israel, right? Hey, there's always in and out, but compared to the 70s, trust me. So the point is, you see Israel today is in the top, basically the 75th percentile. It would have been in the sort of 10th percentile in the 80s, 70s and 80s. So this is one of those countries that has really reformed its economy a lot, more dramatically than almost, especially not if you're out of the Soviet. Obviously, this is also true for Estonia. It's true for Georgia. They were Soviet republics, right? So obviously, they have the same kind of graph. But I don't get them until like 90, because they didn't exist in a data world till 90. The nice thing about Israel is I was able to track Israel's liberal reforms in real time, because we always had data for Israel, so which we didn't have for the Soviets. So I love that. You should be proud of it, I guess. You didn't have anything to do with it. You just live here. But you should be proud of it, really. I'm not going to lie. So let's see, what else? All right, I'm going to try to get towards an ending here. I got a lot of graphs like this. And guess what? They all look like this. This is the data. It's a scattergram with a kind of regression line. Some of them are straight lines because it's pretty linear, and some of them have got a little loggy or something type function to it. Loggy, it's a technical term in economics, loggy. But you can see the red, yellow, green, and blue, just to give you a sense of the distribution. This is GDP per capita, purchasing power parity, real, adjusted, blah, 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 the usual stuff. Beautiful picture. I've got the United States and then sort of you and some neighboring, this is for a report we're putting out for the Freiburg Economic Institute. I just stole the graphs. So that's why these countries are labeled, because these are the countries we were focusing on in the report. It's the Abraham Accord countries plus Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I threw in the US just as a reference point, okay? Hey, look at that, it's beautiful.
About that, you all the time put Israel in the stuff, or a lot of time you say, okay, I put Israel down because we don't see about all the political stuff, or you don't?
I'm not sure I understand.
Like, did you put that, did you put the name Israel just for us, or is it?
No, this is here because I wrote a report for these guys. Yeah, I'm too lazy to do this just for you guys. But like, by the way, the countries that are really, 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 really rich, that's Luxembourg, Singapore, and I think Hong Kong. They're basically city-states. If you just did like New York City, forget America, New York City's dot would be off the chart up there. So those are those really high rich countries. Look, they're all going to look the same, so I'll go through them pretty quickly. If it's a good thing, you're going to see the line go up. If it's a bad thing, you're going to see the line go down. And there's essentially no graph that you can do that doesn't look like this, except, well, this one's a little bit weird. My socialist friends back in college, if they admitted anything about my position being correct, they would say, yeah, capitalism does produce a lot of wealth. They would grudgingly admit that. We know it's true. We saw the data. But they would then say, well, the problem is inequality, right? We all know that's the problem with economic freedom, with capitalism. It's inequality. Turns out that's not true. This is the Gini coefficient. I forget which one right now. It says pre-tax, so no, I know which one. It says it's the pre-tax Gini coefficient. It's even better if you do post-tax, but pre-tax Gini coefficient. You know what? That's a negative line. That means countries with more economic freedom have more income equality, not less. Most people think this line goes the other way, and most people are wrong. Thomas Piketty is wrong. He's empirically wrong. So these are simple regressions, by the way. You can run complicated regressions, you'll get more or less the same answers. Yes?
Maybe because what we talked about in the poor countries, we don't have so much income equality because almost everyone is around the same line,
yeah.
But it's a very low line.
Right.
So like.
But in the poor, no, but the countries, we show you the poor countries are, well, so what this is basically saying is, well, on average, poorer countries are more unequal than richer. It's what, on average. It's very weak. It's not a very strong effect. But
Poor countries are unequal?
yeah. Because you have some rich and then you have mostly poor. So I should mention, except for if you're kind of fun since you're Israeli and you probably care a little bit about the Emirates, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iran. It's funny, if you're below the line, it means you're underperforming. And actually, in this case, all of the countries except for Iran are showing more equality than you would have projected, just on the simple regression. I don't know what that says, but you know, it's kind of neat. Let's see, let's look at a couple more. Life expectancy is that's a very steep slope, right? So, yeah.
We see a difference between like Denmark and United States, like countries that are very free market and give welfare pay.
Well, so welfare is in the index, right? So.
No, with life expectancy.
Oh,
we see like a difference between them?
On just the welfare part?
Yeah.
I've never looked at it. Maybe, I don't know. The U.S. does underperform. A lot of people criticize the U.S. for having low life. Actually, we have really high life expectancy. It's just a little bit lower than you probably would guess it should be, given how rich we are and so forth and so on. It's cars and guns, which I like.
To the previous graph regarding the inequality in more socialist or less free economy government, is it a plausible way to explain because less free economy is much less opportunity for social mobility, and only people that are close to the government will be able to progress forward.
Right.
So a very small amount, right? If you can't create a business, you can't create wealth, then it's people.
Yeah, this is a very static income inequality. It doesn't really deal with the mobility, social mobility thing. There's some data on that. I know a couple friends of mine, academics, who have some work on that. The social mobility data are pretty sketchy. They exist by country, but the nice thing about income inequality data, they're sketchy, but they're not that, comparatively speaking, they're pretty solid numbers. The social mobility numbers, you lose sample size, you can't get as many dots. I'm not as confident in any statement I would make about social mobility. I'm pretty sure though, countries with more economic freedom have more social mobility, and I suspect that's stronger than that.
Yeah. But it's a good indication.
Yeah, I think there's some data. Vincent Geloso is a Canadian academic, and then Justin Collette, I can give you the names later.
Don't you think that there might be a different causality here, that higher GDP causes economical freedom, and that higher GDP causes higher life expectancy?
So given the way we measure things, I think it's more likely to be the other, that we actually, because we divide by GDP a lot as a scalar, you get almost a division bias. And so countries with high GDP end up getting, so there's a possibility that this is embedded in it, yeah. But econometricians do their best to deal with the endogeneity. This is an endogeneity question if you're an econometrician. And all of these results survive that kind of econometric treatment, right? So I'm not worried. I think you're right to bring that up, and you're right to worry about it. But we have statistical methods for trying to deal with that. There have been some, in recent years, this causal inference, whether it's diff and diff or synthetic control or whatever, these newer methods, they don't always work for this kind of data these kinds of data questions. But when they do work, they also are finding pretty strong similar results. So I'm not really that worried about the endogeneity thing, or the sort of reverse causality thing. So yeah, you had a question.
It was actually kind of similar. I wanted to ask if you had ever normalized for wealth.
Wealth?
Wealth, GDP, something similar in that vein.
Well, I don't want to put it in there. So I don't want. I mean, the big question was: do countries have more economic freedom? Are they richer or wealthier? I don't want to. I don't know how
I meant these charts on life expectancy, on Gini coefficient.
So what you're really asking is for a multiple regression. Yeah. So this is not a multiple regression. This is a simple regression, single regression. You'd get a D in a class for that regression. But if you do it, you can control for confounding variables and all that stuff. It'll survive. It'll survive. And we've got a lot of papers. Without exaggeration, there's over 1,000 academic published papers using the index, different things. So let's see. Oops. Infant mortality, that looks beautiful. There's a human capital index the World Bank does. I don't know exactly how they measure it. It's mostly education, though, education levels. Literacy is a little bit weird because you get a lot of countries that truncate at 100% because everyone's literate, but it's still a positive line. This is control of consumption. It's another World Bank. It's World Governance Indicators data. Whoever was asking about civil liberties, so this is the Freedom House Civil Liberties and Political Rights Index. The civil liberties part would be freedom of speech, religion, assembly, whatever. And then the freedom of political rights would be voting, political parties, participation, things like that. So you see, again, it's very, very correlated. I have a whole talk, which I'm not giving at this seminar. I've done it at this seminar in the past, about the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom. It's a very subtle thing. My view, for what it's worth, is the same view that Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek had, is that economic freedom is a necessary but not sufficient condition for political freedom. And it's the not sufficient part that's the kind of carries a lot of weight there. So Hong Kong has a lot of economic freedom, but not a lot of political freedom. But my position is, and Friedman and Hayek's position was, that economic freedom is a necessary condition for political freedom, but it's not a guarantee. Okay, that's why Israel was a little bit weird, because you had the absence of economic freedom, but you still had something like a good liberal democracy. That combination, I would argue, is not a very sustainable one, and I don't think it was sustainable here. But it's a very the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom is a complex one. It's subtle. I think that the data we have are pretty much consistent with Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, though. Let's see what else I got on the graph-wise. Happiness. I think these numbers are garbage. Although I'm way happier giving this talk with a beer than I would have been without, so I'm a solid 8.5 right now. But again, people in more free countries report themselves to be happier on the sort of subjective life satisfaction polls that are done. Yeah.
You have one on depression?
I've never seen data on that. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's the opposite of this. But.
Pretty stable around the world.
Is it?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty stable.
It depends how they define it. Yeah.
I don't have a pretty.
It's the World Health Organization data.
I don't have a pretty scattergram. I'm going to do it though, because I'm liking the scattergrams. I think they're prettier than these bar charts. But this is one we had in the book, and it's the Environmental Performance Index. It's like an index of, my index is a bunch of stuff that is economic freedom. There's these guys that have an index of environmental stuff. Clean air, clean water, whatever. And the good news is, if you're an environmentalist, at least hard socialism is probably not a good solution to your. That doesn't mean you don't care about the environment, but like having government really, the greens or the reds and the yellows and stuff are worse than the blues.
But how do you measure that when the companies are global?
But this is done by country, so I realize that with the clean air thing, because, but with water. So we're measuring this, I'm pretty sure they're measuring emissions though, not like CO2 level or greenhouse like levels of the world. They're doing emissions by that country. So their contribution to the problem, I guess, is how they're doing it. So that seems to be fair.
They check it with regulations, with the regulation of
I'm not sure.
regulations.
About
the environment, because for example, if you see now America, Trump try to do stuff to the other.
So I think it's primarily looking at environmental outcomes. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at the Environmental Performance Index to see what's in it. But I think it was mostly environmental outcomes, like how much are emissions, what are the water quality standards or testing. I don't think it's about the regulations as much as the results. I'm pretty sure that's why it's called a performance index. I'm pretty sure they're measuring the performance, not the sort of inputs, which is different than mine. Mine's more of an input measure.
Yeah. And I have two questions. One, from like a simple standpoint, it seems a little counterintuitive with the economic freedom and environmental sustainability, because sometimes country makes some taxes on polluted factories, something like that, and that's like against economic freedom.
Yeah, so that's right. And I mean, I think those trade-offs absolutely do exist, but my view, and I think in view of a lot of environmental economists, not necessarily the view of a lot of environmental scientists, but environmental economists, GDP is important. GDP, wealth, income, being rich, allows us the luxury of having some of those regulations, like scrubbers on smokestacks to reduce sulfur dioxide, water treatment plants to clean the water before it goes back out into the lakes and rivers and so forth. GDP does a lot to clean up the environment. And so to the extent economic freedom allows countries to earn greater GDPs, that then gives them more resources to deal with those environmental problems when they arise. So I think that's a very standard sort of position among environmental economists. Environmental scientists don't always see it that way. They just see the problem and they want to find a regulation to solve the problem. The question is, what's the economic cost of that, right? And is there a cheaper way? And if the regulation causes you to lose GDP, that ultimately, that you're shooting yourself in the foot a little bit, right? So I think there's a tension in the environmental world. Like I've noticed that environmental economists, I mean, I'm talking about like left-wing, environmental, Greenpeace type economists, they are fighting pretty hard against sort of environmental scientists because of their sort of, they just don't care about GDP. And I'm like, and the environmental economists, like, GDP has done a lot to clean the environment. Like, just because we're rich, we can afford stuff. We have the technology to do things, So there's a tension there. I think that, it's a different conversation.
And I have a follow-up question, if I may.
This is the last question.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
So,
do whatever beer after. We have a website. There's several ways to get there, and you don't need a website name anymore. Just Google it. But there is a competing index. The Heritage Foundation has an index. It's garbage. Don't use it. And in seriousness, it's garbage. Don't use it. But ours is the Fraser Institute one. It's a Canadian think tank, although I'm an American. That's published by a Canadian group. So if you want to get the data, you can go to the website, download the data set, play around with maps, and you can disaggregate the individual components. You can see the sources, all of that, all the math, stuff like that. So thank you. I think we're done.